In this video, I'm going to show you how to make this bag from start to finish. Use the link in the description to get your plans, and let's get into it. So I'm using two different leathers for this project. The main body and the zipper panel is made out of this 3 to 4 ounce green Mexico leather. And the secondary leather is this 2 to 3 ounce gray Minerva Vachetta. The interior is going to be lined with this 1 to 2 ounce pigskin leather. For the hardware, I've got two 1.5 inch swivel lever snaps, two 1-inch D-rings. I'm also using a 1.5 inch double loop and a single loop, which is not shown there. I'm using a black collar stud to secure the zipper panel to the gusset. And finally, I have a 12-inch number 5 YKK zipper, and I will be replacing the pull tab with this open tab version so that I can add a leather pull. And the thread I'll be using for this project is this gray 0.45 millimeter linen thread. For the strap, I'll be using this 1.25 inch canvas webbing. So I'm going to be using my laser to cut out all of the pieces for this project. If you've been considering getting a laser and would like to know more about my setup, check out the video links above. If you're interested in getting a laser for your shop, check out the links in the description. If you don't have a laser, simply print out the plans full scale, glue them onto some nice heavy cardstock, trace it onto your leather, and cut it out by hand. So these are all the pieces I'm going to need to complete this bag. So I'm using 180 sandpaper just to remove any loose char that's on the edge of each of the leather pieces. Sometimes this char can fall off while you're using it. It gets on your hands, you then rub it into the piece, and it can ruin a whole piece of leather. I also use these custom-made sanding drums. This is that same 180 grit sandpaper wrapped around the mandrel, and this makes quick work of that loose char. So I need to start by edge finishing the top of my bottom panel and the bottom of my two side gusset trim pieces. So here I'm using one of those custom mandrels with 600 grit sandpaper just to smooth out that edge in preparation for edge paint. So after that first coat of edge paint, I just come through with some 220 sandpaper, lightly sand it down to get it smooth again, follow it up with another coat of edge paint until it's nice and smooth. Here I'm just using this crepe rubber to clean up any paint that's on the face of the leather. And the final step is just using this rubbing alcohol to smooth out that edge paint. This does a really good job of cleaning up that edge and really finishing it off nicely. So moving on to the gusset trim pieces, I need to start by skiving down the top and both sides, as well as the sides and bottom of the actual gusset piece. Around all these edges, I'm aiming for a final thickness of about 1 millimeter. After I glue everything together, add the lining, total edge thickness should come out to around about 3 millimeters, which is pretty good for a nice edge paint. Using my paper template, I mark a line and then rough up the area where my gusset trim is going to get glued down. I can then pre-punch my gusset trim in preparation for stitching, and I'll go ahead and pre-punch the entire gusset while I'm at it. I then come through and pre-stitch the bottom of the gusset trim before I add my lining so that the inside doesn't see any stitching. So using my paper template, I mark my glue line on the front and back panel, and then with some sandpaper, just rough up that area. Once that's done, I'll come through and glue in my bottom panel to the front and back. With the panels all glued up, I can now come through and pre-punch the entire perimeter as well as the top of the bottom panel in preparation for that stitching. Where the bottom piece and the main panel overlap, I just skive that piece out to 0 so that the thickness is even all the way along the entire body panel. Then we can go ahead and stitch these pieces together. With all that done, it's now time to stamp my logo on the logo patch. Now, the numbers here may differ based on your machine and the leather you're working with, but for me, using veg tan, 150 degrees works perfectly to stamp veg tan and as well do the foil stamp on it. Using my logo patch template, I line up my logo in the center of it and then trace it around to get the perimeter. I then went ahead, pre-punched that patch and edge painted the bottom portion that's going to get stitched to the main panel. I did not finish the top because that'll get finished once everything's assembled. So now I'm going to attach my collar stud using the paper template as a guide. At this point, I've got my main panel done, stitched together, logo patch attached, and the gussets have their trim pieces and the hardware as needed. So to fill the gap between the two panels, I'm using this material called Brio. It's designed to be used in the base of bags and to provide maximum stiffness in panel pieces. I measured the gap between these two panels just to make sure this reinforcement piece would fit perfectly. I then measured the length between the two corners and then trimmed it to its final length. I've used this material before in other projects, but I've never been in a situation where I had to skive out the ends, and this is not fun material to skive at all. As rigid as this material is, there's quite a bit of elasticity to it, so every time I would try to skive it out, it kind of just push away from the blade. It took quite a bit of effort to get this thing skived down to 0, but eventually got it. Once it was all skived down, I just added glue to the flat side of the reinforcement, to the bottom side of the bag, and then stuck it all together. I then came through, tied off those loose threads, added some glue, and then laid them down right on the inside of that stitch line. Afterwards, I'll come through and then trim those excess threads to length. In order for the collar stud to not be seen on the inside of the bag, once we add our lining, I'm going to add this little leather patch. This patch I'm just skiving out to 0. Once it's glued on top, you won't feel or see any of the collar stud on the inside. So with that patch glued in place, I also glue down that excess thread and then trim it to length, and then add some glue to my lining, add the glue to the back of my gussets, and then stick it all together. With the lining in place, I can now punch all the way through along the perimeter of the gusset. I can then run a quick stitch all the way through the top of the gussets. To finish off this stitch, I actually ran the very last stitch through the main part and the lining, and then knotted it and glued it back in place. That way there's a seamless transition when I do the main stitch. With the top of the gusset stitched up, I can now trim off the excess lining and finish off some edge paint along the top. So when you're adding a lining to a bag like this, it's easy to actually glue the lining crooked. If you do this, then you'll actually see a crease on the inside of the bag, and that's not good. To avoid this crease, I add 5 millimeters around the entire perimeter of the bag. All these marks will help guide me when I'm gluing the leather in place to make sure the lining stays nice and straight. So I start by adding glue to the very top edge of the lining and about the top third along the sides. I find it easier to glue a lining in stages versus gluing the entire perimeter all at once. Sometimes once that lining goes in, it's pretty flimsy, so it gets a little tricky to manage. So doing it in these stages really helps keeps everything nice and clean and crisp. Once that top third is glued and set, I'll come through and glue the bottom curve, making sure that I actually fold the main body over to its final shape before I press that lining into place. With the lining in place, it's just a matter of coming through and re-punching all of those stitching holes. I also came through and trimmed off the excess lining. Before I can glue in my gussets, I need to finish off these D-ring patches. So I'm just adding a bit of edge paint to the tops and the bottoms, mark my stitch line, pre-punch those holes, and then we'll glue those in place before our gussets go in. I also thinned out the wings of these D-ring patches right out to 0, removing as much of the bulk from there as I can so that it doesn't make the gusset glue line too thick. I'm also adding this reinforcement tape in the middle of that D-ring just to prevent any stretching that may occur over time. Where the D-ring patches connect, I need to pre-finish that corner because once those patches are glued in, it's going to be very difficult to edge paint that small little edge. Before we glue our gussets to the main panel, we want to get center marks on the gussets and the main panel. This will help keep everything lined up once the glue is in place and we're trying to get everything stuck properly. I also give myself a rough mark for the top of the gusset with where I want to start my glue. I'm also going to skive down the lining to about 1/2 mil. I'm also going to skive down the lining on the main portion of the bag to about 1/2 mil. It's important to remember when you're skiving in this manner that you should only skive starting at your stitch line. You don't want to go below that or else you're going to see it once everything's glued up. So with all that done, we can now finally glue in the D-ring patches right up to the top of the bag. I just use my needles to make sure everything lines up properly, and then we can go ahead and glue in our gussets. So I start by gluing one gusset in at a time, starting from that center mark that we made earlier. So to keep everything lined up, I used 2 needles in the 2 most center holes. I then stepped over 4 or 5 holes, 2 more needles just before the bend around the corner of the gusset. And then came up to the top of the gusset with the needle through the matching hole in the main body, stepped out a few more hole spacings just to make sure everything's staying lined up, and then I'm able to slowly start pressing everything together. Once both gussets are glued in place, you can go ahead and stitch them in place. Once our gussets are all stitched up, it's just time to clean up that edge and get some paint on. The zipper I had came with a standard zipper pull, which I wanted to replace with an open pull so that I could add a leather tab to it. Once that was done, I could align the bottom stop with the end of the zipper panel and then mark the location of the last two zipper teeth that I was going to remove. I could then measure back from those teeth about an inch and then cut off the excess zipper tape. Then I just had to come through with my end snips and remove all those excess zipper teeth. I could then add the two end stops and finish off the zipper tape. Before I assemble the zipper tape to the zipper panel, I'm going to stitch in the leather pull tab. I added a thin strip of a non-stretch tape to the tab just because it's going to see a lot of use and I don't want that leather to stretch out over time. With the zipper tape done, I could then come through and finish off the inside edges where the zipper tape will be attached. For these edges, I'm just using a standard burnish with 50% toconol and 50% water. Because the zipper tape is porous, it required a bit more glue than when adding glue to the leather piece. I made sure to spread out the glue on the zipper panel nice and thin so that there was no possibility of any squeeze out on the face side of the zipper panel. I then would use my awl just to make sure that those end stops were aligned properly right into the corner of that zipper panel opening. I could then add the glue to the entire zipper panel, again making sure to avoid the parts of the zipper that are going to be seen on the inside. I then came through and punched my stitching holes around the perimeter of the zipper tape. I also came through at this point and pre-punched the perimeter of the actual zipper panel. Whenever I have two stitch lines come together in a point, I always use my awl instead of punching through with my stitching chisels. Both ends of the zipper panel need to be done now, and they're both stitched up to the straight part of the zipper panel. This will get stitched into the main body later. With the ends done, I could then stitch in around the zipper panel. I could then edge finish the two ends of the zipper panel. And I always use a Columbus wax to finish off a painted edge. And with that, our zipper panel is done, so we can now stitch it to the main body. I'm applying the glue between the stitch holes and the edge of the leather. I don't want to have glue over top of my stitch holes because I've double punched this. If I have glue covering the stitch holes, it's going to make stitching the holes much more difficult because it's going to be super sticky with that dried glue. So you can see here I have glue on both sides of the panel. I should have done one side at a time. Having glue on both sides makes it a little bit more difficult to manage because you don't want the other side of the zipper panel touching the interior of the bag, getting glue all over the place. I also added needles in each corner to keep those edges aligned nicely. and then a needle in the middle to make sure my stitch holes were aligning properly. Stitching this part of the bag is a little bit cumbersome because I wasn't able to figure out a good way to hold the bag, so I just sat on my stool and put the bag between my knees, and it seemed to work. So the stitching is done. I can now come through and sand down the top two edges, getting it nice and flat and smooth in preparation for edge paint. So I designed this bag intentionally to have these two fairly thick edges right on top. Because they're such a heavy feature of this design, it's important to get that edge paint as smooth and clean as possible. So to do that, I started with a very heavy first layer of paint to really get a nice foundation for all the subsequent layers that I would then sand down through and use to get a nice smooth finished edge. So for the strap, I'm using this 1.5 inch thick canvas webbing. And to finish off the ends, I do a very small 45-degree miter right off the corners, and then use a lighter to melt the end. And because I've used my laser to cut out these small pieces, I have to sand out the char. And while I'm at it, I'm going to go ahead and just finish up all of the edges on all of the leather pieces. So this style strap has two different pieces. One short canvas piece cut at about 7 inches, and the longer piece cut at 50 inches. And on the shorter piece, I'm attaching the single loop hardware. And while I'm at it, I go ahead and attach the buckle on the other end. After looping the long strap through the single loop hardware, I can then attach the double loop to one end of the long strap. While I had the strap laid out, I added a few of these binder clips to the ends just to hold everything in place. And then I also went through and made sure all of my hardware was oriented properly on the strap so that it would function correctly. Then it was just a matter of stitching everything together. So that is our completed, fully adjustable crossbody strap. One thing I've added here is a nice edge crease around all of the edges of the bag. It's going to be easier to do some of these edge creases before everything's assembled, so I'm going ahead and doing those edge creases now. Edge creasing is fairly simple to learn. It just takes a bit of practice. It can get a little tricky when you're dealing with really tight curves like this 3mm rounded edge. You'll just have to practice it until you get comfortable doing it on your final piece. Around the curve on the bottom panel, the stitch spacing increases to 4mm from the 3.38 that is on the rest of the bag. This has to be accounted for because the bottom panel is covering a longer distance than the gusset piece. So the gusset is punched at 3.38 all the way around, but in that corner we have to adjust the spacing, which works out to exactly 4mm. So if you had a 4mm stitching iron, you could simply punch those holes. I don't, so I just use my single iron. The front and back panel have been extended so that they provide a bit more structure to the bottom of the bag. I found in the first version of this bag that it was a little bit tippy, so by adding this extra leather to the sides and around the corner, it actually provides a nice stable base for the bag. I wanted to try out a different closure option for the zipper panel, so I selected this magnetic snap. Now the mechanism you decide to use will be dependent on what you have and what you'd like to purchase, so the plans now include the 2 prong holes for the magnetic snaps like you see here, or just the center hole for a collar stud or some other option. While I'm working with the gusset, I just want to mention the total thickness that you're aiming for along your edge. I always aim for 3 millimeters in total thickness. I find that to be a good thickness to get a nice clean painted edge. So regardless of the material weight you're working with, I aim for 1 millimeter along the edge for the main panel, and for any lining material, I aim for 0.5 millimeter. That gets me my total 3 mil. So that you don't see the magnetic snap on the inside, I didn't glue the gusset lining all the way down. I just glued it along the edge and left the interior loose. I also added some additional paper reinforcement to the top of the front and back panel, as well as the center of the bottom. What's great about using this heavy cardstock is that it's already very thin and it provides just enough structure to provide the support needed in the areas that you need it. As thin as it is, it does still need to be skived out to 0 just so that you don't feel any ridges on the interior lining. I've sized these reinforcement pieces so that they sit just inside the stitch line so that you don't have to stitch through them. The 2 reinforcement pieces that go along the top of each panel get glued along the sides and the top, just so that it has some room to move and flex with the bag. This bottom reinforcement piece helps smooth out the bottom so that you don't feel any of the reinforcement material that's underneath it. Once it's trimmed to size and skived out, you're just going to add glue along the very center of this piece and then glue along the reinforcement underneath it, leaving both of the sides open so that they can sit flat along the inside of the bag. I also modified my D-ring patch. Now this is going to be different for each piece of hardware because the thickness of your D-ring will likely vary from mine. So the actual dimensions that are in the PDF file may not work for yours, but here's the logic that I used when I made this one. So the first time around, I wanted it as small and as tight to the D-ring as possible. I wanted it to blend in with the bag so that you basically wouldn't see it. The problem with doing this is that this patch becomes pretty small and it's difficult to work with. I also find that because of how it's attached to the bag, you still see it and you still notice it. So instead of attempting to hide it, I figured you may as well almost make it a feature so that if you see it, you do notice it. So to accomplish that, I made the width of the wings wider so that you'd see it on the inside of the bag. I also made the interior dimension slightly larger so that the D-ring had a little more room to move. Again, your hardware is going to be different, so this D-ring patch in the PDF may not work for you, but experiment, do a few samples, and see which method is going to work best for your particular hardware. In the PDF, you can find the drawings for this magnetic closure mechanism if you're going to be using something similar. One thing I tried differently for attaching the zipper to the zipper panel was using this double-sided tape. Sometimes the glue can get a little messy, so I actually prefer using this double-sided tape to attach the zipper to the top panel of the piece. The other small change I made to the zipper panel was right here. This portion that I'm creasing right now used to be angled. It is now square to the top edge of the zipper panel. The other thing I did differently this time, which I believe I mentioned in part 2 of this video series, is only gluing one side of the zipper panel to the bag at a time. This makes it a lot easier to manage because I don't have glue on the other side of the zipper panel that could potentially get onto the inside of the bag. So that's it for this series. If you haven't already, head over to my website, norfolkhandmade.com. Check out the plans and follow along with this build series. If you have any questions or comments, leave them below. And if you end up making this, be sure to tag me on Instagram, norfolk.handmade. Thanks for watching, everyone. We'll see you in the next one.